Liberty's Teeth here, and welcome back to the Tin Hat Ranch channel. This is part 3 of the Surviving Nuclear series, Dealing with Radiation. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, I suggest you watch them first as they are prerequisite to part 3. In part 2, I gave you some general guidelines on whether or not to stay put or bug out in the event of a nuclear bomb. After making your decision, if radiation is still a threat, and it might be if you stayed or you couldn't get far enough away, your next task is to begin minimizing your risk to radiation. The fallout is coming, and you know from the first videos how much to expect and when it might arrive. Since this video is dealing with radiation, let us first talk a little bit about what radiation is and the basic principles behind avoiding it. When talking about radiation, there are 3 types of radiation and 3 ways to lessen your exposure. In a nuclear event, the 3 types of radiation you have to deal with are alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma radiation. Without getting too scientific, when a bomb explodes, it releases neutrons. These neutrons are absorbed by other atoms and make unstable isotopes of the original atoms. These unstable isotopes must become stable, and in the process emit different forms of radiation. These neutrons are also responsible for much of the initial radiation received by people very close to the nuclear blast. The first type of radiation is alpha particles. This type of radiation is not dangerous unless it is inhaled or ingested. Although an alpha particle can be stopped by a piece of paper or your skin, if fallout that emits alpha particles is inhaled or ingested, it can be very dangerous. The second type is beta radiation. These are high-speed electrons that can penetrate a little more than alpha. The dangers involved with beta are inhalation and ingestion, as well as if you get fallout particles on your skin. They can cause what could be considered a very, very bad nuclear sunburn. For this video, we are not going to worry much about alpha or beta. You will worry about these more after you emerge from your shelter. The third type of radiation is gamma radiation. This is the type that we will be worried about in the initial hours and days after a nuclear attack. Gamma rays are very high energy photons and can penetrate much more mass than alpha or beta. The focus of this video is primarily going to be reducing your exposure to gamma radiation. The 3 ways to reduce your exposure to radiation are time, distance, and shielding. Reducing the amount of time you are exposed will affect your overall dose of radiation. For instance, limiting the amount of time you are outdoors in a nuclear event and staying in your shelter. The more time that passes after an event, the lower the radiation. Think of radiation kind of like a battery that is discharging energy. At first, it can discharge quite a bit, but as time passes, the amount lowers until it is barely keeping a charge. Know the 7-10 rule. For every 7 hours that pass, radiation is reduced to 1/10 the initial amount. For example, if you have 1,000 Roentgens an hour at the time of the blast, 7 hours later it will be 100 Roentgens. Another 7 hours later it will be 10, and so on. Distance. This is an obvious one. The further away you are from a radiation source, the less radiation you will receive. Last is shielding. The more mass you can put between you and the source, the less radiation you will receive. For instance, if you have a source of 100 gamma rays of radiation and you put a sheet of lead that is 4/10 of an inch thick between you and the source, you will only receive 50 of those rays. The lead will stop half. This is called a halving thickness. If you put another sheet of lead between you and the source, you will again have the number of rays that reach you to 25. You can keep adding mass until you take a dangerous source and reduce it to something that is survivable. Lead is not the only thing that will absorb gamma radiation. Anything will. 2.4 inches of concrete will have the amount of radiation, as will 3.6 inches of dirt or 7.2 inches of water. The more dense the material, the less it takes. So, time, distance, and shielding are the 3 ways to reduce your exposure to radiation. Assuming we are now in a position where you cannot put further distance between you and the fallout, it is now time to improvise with what you have to reduce as much as possible your risk to radiation. We are shooting to reduce your total exposure in the first week after the bomb to 100 rems or less. This is because 100 rems is about the highest dose of radiation the average human body will tolerate before a percentage of the people start dying. A rem is an absorbed dose of radiation. For instance, if there is 100 Roentgens an hour of radiation present, and you are exposed for 1 hour, you will have received 100 rems. Remember, a nuclear bomb just exploded. You are going to be exposed to radiation. You cannot avoid it. We will just attempt to reduce it as much as possible. After you have picked the place where you will hunker down, go to the lowest level of the building. If you have a basement, go to an outside corner. Basement corners are obviously the best, as you have concrete and dirt on two sides of you. If you don't have a basement, go to the room that is centermost of the building. Find 2 pieces of sturdy furniture, like 2 desks, or a desk and a serving table, or a really sturdy table, and place them where your shelter will be. Take off a couple of interior doors and place them across the pieces of furniture. If you happen to have a plastic sheet or a tarp, drape it over the door-covered furniture. Put your water and any ready-to-eat food or your bug-out bag inside. Make sure you have a way of accessing the food, such as a can opener. If you have an empty bucket, garbage bags, or anything that can be used to evacuate human waste, bring it inside. Also, bring in something like a cookie sheet or an item you can fan air with. Lastly, bring a weapon. Remember, evil black rifles are the best. Quickly try to find the most dense materials in the building and start piling them around and on top of your shelter. What you are aiming to do is put as much mass between you and the fallout on all exposed sides. You have a decent idea of how much time you have at this point before the fallout arrives, so start working. Phone books, stacks of newspapers, tiles left over from a home improvement project, sheets of drywall, anything. Pile it from floor to ceiling if you can. If you have a second floor, you can pile things directly above your shelter as well. If the water still works, it's time to dump the garbage you've been storing for years in those plastic totes and fill them up, and place them around and on top of the shelter. Remember, water is a decent material to block radiation. Rip off those granite countertops. Get rocks and stones or chunks of concrete if they are available. If you feel you have the time, a couple of hours maybe, you can start piling dirt from the outside around you, or pile it up against the house in the corner where your shelter will be. If you run out of room in the room you are in, continue piling it in the surrounding rooms. You are shooting for about 100 pounds of stuff per square foot around you. You will obviously have to leave an entrance, but don't make the path straight. Make it at a 90-degree angle, as you see here. This is because gamma rays travel in straight lines for the most part. You should prepare yourself mentally that you might have to spend up to 2 weeks in this shelter. Don't worry about storing 2 weeks worth of food inside the shelter. After a few days, it will be safe to go to other parts of your house or building for a short period of time to get other foods. If they are in a sealed container, they should be safe to eat. Once the fallout starts to arrive, get in your shelter. Stay inside for at least the first 48 hours. Don't leave for anything. After the first 48 hours, you can venture out for a minute or two at most to get more food or get rid of waste. Each day after, you will probably spend more and more time out of the shelter, but continue to spend the entire time possible inside the shelter. If this was a single event, I would use the emergency radio inside your bug-out bag to get news on when it is safe to leave. If you don't have one, stay in your shelter for 2 weeks. So what does doing these things do to your level of exposure? Let's compare this to what I feel would be a comparable event most likely to happen in 2013, a terrorist nuke or a North Korean bomb. We can use data from the Trinity test because it was a surface burst more or less that would be comparable in size to these two current threats. On July 16, 1945, the United States exploded the first nuclear weapon. It was a 20-kiloton device on top of a 100-foot tall tower. The fireball touched the ground, vaporizing some of the sand, and sucked it up into the fireball. Here is a map of the fallout that was recorded from the event. Notice 75 Roentgens per hour was recorded at 1 hour after the explosion out to 10 miles. If you were 10 miles downrange with a 10-mile-an-hour wind facing you, your dose would start at 75 Roentgens an hour. About an hour and a half outside would give you the 100 Roentgen dose we are trying to stay under. 3 or 4 hours and your risk of death would start climbing rapidly. Let's say your improvised shelter was able to halve the radiation by 5 times. Your exposure for the first hour would be cut down to just over 2 Roentgens an hour, from 75 Roentgens down to 2. If your improvised shelter provided only 2 halving thicknesses, your first hour dose would only be 19 rems. In other words, with 5 halving thicknesses, you could spend 50 hours in a shelter before receiving a potentially lethal dose, and with 2 halving thicknesses, you could spend 5 hours. Remember that 7-10 rule. The radiation is dropping as time passes. That 75 Roentgens per hour will be 7.5 in 7 hours. If you had been outside, you probably would have received a possibly lethal dose. Inside, the dose you received may not even show any symptoms. This brings us to the end of the third part of the series. Please note that so far I have shown you how to increase your chances of survival with little or no preparation. I have a feeling that most of you watching might invest a little more time and money in preparation. There will be a final video for those not willing to prepare beyond basic knowledge called Emerging from the Shelter and Living with Radiation. For the rest of you, I am going to continue the series on preparation with things you can do right now to prepare for an event such as this. Things like making a radiation meter or a real fallout shelter. Thanks for watching the Tin Hat Ranch channel, and please subscribe.